The Congress of the United States is the legislative branch of the federal government. It has two houses, a balanced bicameral structure, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Confusingly, although all are members of Congress, the members of the House of Representatives are known as congressmen or women and styled representative only when written down. The 435 congressmen and women represent roughly equal districts by population. There are also 5 delegates who represent strange areas like the US Virgin Islands or Washington DC, and they can speak but they can't vote. The 100 senators are 2 from each state. The Vice President is the Speaker of the Senate and votes only to break a tie. This is the one sort of area where the separation of powers is a bit suspended, because you have someone from the executive branch appointed by the President, the Vice President, although probably someone who was elected, who has a role in the Senate. But their role in the Senate is limited unless they have to break a tie, although that is more likely in recent years, where the Senate has been very, very even between Democrats and Republicans. The powers of Congress are clearly referred to in the Constitution in Article 1. Incidentally, that it is Article 1 indicates the importance that the framers of the Constitution put on the legislative branch of government. Thanks to the Connecticut Compromise, there's both a House of Representatives, which is meant to be very democratic and represent population, and a Senate, which represents the federal history of the United States and gives equal power to every state with 2 senators. It's not unusual to have a bicameral legislature in big countries, and particularly in federal countries, for similar reasons as those in the United States. But it is unusual that the houses are so equally balanced in power. Usually the upper house is more of a patrician check, or the lower house is pointless, as in France. But in America, they're very evenly balanced. This, of course, contrasts with the United Kingdom, where the House of Lords, since the Parliament Act of 1911, has very little real power. The powers of Congress are detailed in the Constitution. Some are enumerated powers that are laid out very clearly in the Constitution, and others are implied powers. The enumerated powers, the ones laid out, include the power to lay and collect taxes, known as the power of the purse, the power to borrow money, which shows that the deficit and national debt of the United States was not something the framers didn't imagine, the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And although this is an enumerated power, which is clear when it comes to who's in charge of negotiating treaties of trade with foreign nations, the use of the Commerce Clause has also given an implied power to regulate all sorts of activity using this clause. The power to coin money, interestingly, number 8 here, subsidizing arts and science, is actually something in the Constitution which you may find surprising in such a sort of liberal individualist constitution. The power to establish all courts apart from the Supreme Court. Interesting here, an area where the separation of powers is not so clear. All courts are established by Congress apart from the Supreme Court, which stands above that. And the power to declare war. Another interesting one, because we know that the President is Commander-in-Chief, so here there's a clash, or at least some sort of concurrence with powers of the Presidency and Congress. Now we go on to the implied powers of Congress under the Constitution. And as I said, some of these come with various clauses, including the Commerce Clause, but the most obvious case is the Elastic Clause, where Congress is said to have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The House, as we said, represents equal districts by population, and they're elected on 2-year terms. So every 2 years, the entire House is up for election. So on one cycle, that's at the same time as the presidency, and then in another cycle, for example, 2018, in about a year's time, there are mid-term elections. Now, the constitutional framers thought this would be much more democratic, but in practice, such an expensive and frequent set of elections means that congressmen do everything that they possibly can to make incumbency a benefit and reduce the competitiveness of their elections, mostly through gerrymandering. That's redistricting. Both parties have an incentive to reduce the amount of competitiveness in House seats. This gives some states much more power effectively because they have greater population, which stands to reason. Some states, Alaska, Montana, North and South Dakota, have such small populations that they have only one congressman, which is amazing because of course they still have 2 senators. The House is led by the Speaker of the House, and there's also a House Majority and a House Minority Leader and whips for both parties. The Speaker of the House, though, has the most power, and it's not only the power to sort of up to a point dictate when legislation is brought to the House, but also it's the power to appoint the chair of committees. Remember that all committees in the House of Representatives and indeed the Senate have a majority of the majority party, and the chair is always from the majority party. Keeping the Democrats in line is Nancy Pelosi, the House Minority Leader. You can see her handing the gavel over to Paul Ryan in this picture because, of course, the Democrats at one point were in majority in the House of Representatives. If they gain the majority in the 2018 midterms, be aware that their roles would reverse, and Nancy Pelosi would then have tremendous power, not just from having a majority in the House, but also to appoint committee chairs. The Senate has 100 members, and every state is equal in the Senate. They serve 6-year terms, so at each election cycle, only a third of senators are up for re-election. The Senate is in practice led by the majority leader, at the moment Senator Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. Again, the majority leader has tremendous power because he can decide mostly when legislation is brought to the Senate, and he tries to corral his senators to vote the way he wants. He's obviously a very important ally for the president, as the Senate Majority Leader always is, and if bipartisanship is required, which you might argue is often required when the Senate is fairly close in terms of votes, the Minority Leader is also very important. The Senate has the rule of unlimited debate, although various Senate rules have been passed to limit this. And unlimited debate allows senators to filibuster, that is, to talk down a bill by just keeping the debate going and going and going until the end of session. Nowadays, in most cases, the filibuster can be closed by a 3/5 vote of the Senate, known as a cloture motion. Now, that means that there's even more emphasis on there being bipartisanship, because although it's quite possible that in this day and age one party will have a decent majority in the Senate, having 3/5 is unlikely. As I've hinted so far, the committees of Congress are very, very important. The Congress has standing committees, usually pretty much on the same basis both in the House and the Senate, which is another level of repetition when it comes to making legislation. And they also have a very important role for oversight. That is, they are the legislative branch's way of checking the executive branch and agencies in their area of expertise. So, for example, the House Intelligence Committee would provide oversight to make sure the CIA and the FBI are behaving well. Those committees are usually closed to the public for national security reasons, but all the others provide quite a public way for Congress to check the power of the executive branch. And this is obviously going to be highly politicized, especially at the moment in American politics, with a very divided and partisan nation. Now, congressmen and senators like getting on committees, particularly getting the chair or the minority leadership of committees, because it allows them to get lots of perks for their constituency. It gives them power to amend bills in committee stage to add spending which they favour. Up to a point, committee chairmanship and committee membership goes on seniority, although the House leadership can appoint people to committees. So your standing as a congressman in terms of your age and tenure and authority and how well liked you are by the leadership allows you to get onto a committee, which allows you to amend bills to add spending for your district or state, which allows you to be popular as an incumbent and continue to vote. This is the sort of political momentum that leads to overspending by the American government and the kind of politics that puts a lot of people off Congress. Remember, as a political point, although the current president, for example, is hugely unpopular with quite a large number of people in the United States, the president still does not have the kind of unpopularity of Congress, because people in America well know how sort of, well, corrupt is a strong word, but how politicized and difficult to get things done things are in Congress. Congress in session is Congress on public exhibition, whilst Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work, said President Woodrow Wilson. And this quotation is very useful for essays and is the sort of thing they'd be expected. What is interesting is he said this in his PhD thesis in 1885, well before he knew everything there was to know about politics by being in it. So we can perhaps take it with a bit more of a pinch of salt than you might think at first glance. There are lots of powers of Congress given to it by the Constitution. We said that they were enumerated powers, and there are implied powers, and some are powers which are reserved just for the House or just for the Senate, known as exclusive powers, and there are some which are concurrently held by both the House and Senate. Most importantly, remember, passing legislation requires going through the committee and voting on the floor stages of both the House and the Senate, and then some sort of resolution between the two versions of the House and Senate, perhaps in a conference committee, or perhaps it bounces back until they can agree before it goes to the President, who may still not sign it. And it's this complication of the concurrent power of legislation between the two houses, which may of course not be controlled by the same party, and the fact that the President's required to sign, which causes gridlock. Gridlock being defined as the system whereby legislation is very difficult to pass because of the structure of the US legislative process under the Constitution. The House has the power of the purse. It initiates money bills generally, and has more power over appropriations, that is, getting money which can then go to a department to be spent, than any other part of any other branch of government. It also has the power to impeach federal officials up to the president. Now, that's interesting at this present moment in time because things are so politicised that if the Democrats won the House, you might imagine that they would try and impeach President Trump. And if the Electoral College is in deadlock on the popular vote, then the House would elect a president. The Senate uniquely has the power to confirm appointments, and that includes appointments for almost all senior federal posts, such as cabinet members, ambassadors, and indeed Supreme Court justices. So that advice and consent power of the Senate is a very, very significant one. They also have uniquely the power to ratify treaties, and even if a president or some other federal official is impeached by the House, their case is then heard by the Senate, which may or may not decide to convict, as it were, on the impeachment. And in the case of the Electoral College being deadlocked, the Senate appoints the Vice President. The rest of the powers are shared between the House and the Senate. Most importantly, the power to pass legislation which has to go through both houses and has to be reconciled to be the same through both houses, which, as we said, can cause gridlock. They also have the power together to override a presidential veto by 2/3 majority. And overriding a presidential veto also requires a supermajority of 2/3 in both the House and the Senate, as does initiating constitutional amendments, which requires a 2/3 majority from both the House and the Senate before going to the individual states. The House and the Senate can together declare war, and they confirm the appointed vice presidents.